We'll begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northeast Metro Climate Action's February event. We're calling it Burned. Your trash is in someone else's backyard. And my name is Kate Windsor. I want to thank the Sierra Club tonight for loaning us the use of their Zoom account. And we are recording this presentation, so if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your cameras. Before we begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement. We do this every time we have an event. We are meeting on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe people who continue to live in the area and exercise their treaty rights on this land and surrounding waters. So we humbly work to honor this living history. So most of you are familiar faces or names, but I will just go through what Northeast Metro Climate Action is. Our acronym spells NEMCA, and that's how we refer to ourselves. We are a local group of neighbors and friends and like-minded community members who are concerned about having a cleaner, healthier, and sustainable future, and we're all volunteers. Our mission is to broaden the awareness of the climate crisis to our neighbors and communities and elected officials. And we carry out this mission by hosting monthly events like this one. And we're also actively involved in educating our local and state politicians. So speaking of monthly events, our I said it was our February event. It's actually January still. Never mind, it's our January event. In February, we're going to have an event on the 18th at 6:30, which will both be at the White Bear Lake Library and on Zoom. And the subject is food waste and food choices. Then in March, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be meeting in person on Saturday, the 22nd at 11 a.m. And we're gathering at the barn at the Maplewood Historical Center to learn about the benefits of non-native plants, which is something we don't talk about a lot. So more information about these events will be posted on our Facebook page, which you can find under Northeast Metro Climate Action. And we also have a website under the same name. So our co-hosts for tonight's event are Northwest Metro Climate Action, Resilient Roseville, Indivisible North Metro Environment Team, the Climate Justice Team of St. Croix Valley Indivisible, Vote Climate, and the Vadnais Heights Green Team. So thank you to all our co-sponsors. So I ask that you mute your microphones during tonight's presentation, and you can put your questions in the chat, or you can save them until the end when you can raise your hand to unmute yourself and ask your question in person. So tonight's speaker is Krystle, and Krystle, I'm very sorry, I was going to ask you prior to the event on the pronunciation of your last name, so I'm going to take a stab. D'Alencar.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm using my phone. I've never had this problem before, so I apologize.
Oh,
But if you can't hear me, you need me to speak louder, please let me know.
okay.
But it's D'Alencar. It looks
Oh,
like it's
D'Alencar.
trickier than it is. Yeah, just D'Alencar, but yeah.
Okay. So Krystle D'Alencar, who's an organizer who focuses on campaigns that center on community-led solutions to environmental justice issues. And they specialize in base building, supporting frontline community leadership, political education, and campaign strategies. They also work in coalition building, legislative advocacy, and research that supports movement building, grounding in the knowledge of communities most impacted by the climate crisis. And Krystle has been working on shutting down the HERC, which is an incinerator operating in North Minneapolis that's been impacting the health of the residents of the area for more than 30 years. And they will also talk about where Ramsey County trash ends up. So Krystle, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And thanks, Lori. Thank you everyone for having me tonight. I'm excited to present to you guys on kind of the issue on probably one of the most, if not the most out of sight, out of mind issue I think that we all deal with, which is trash. So yeah, happy to start whenever you guys are ready, unless you have kind of other agenda items to go through first.
That's it. Go
Okay,
ahead.
great. All right, and I'll share my screen here. Let me just, yeah, okay, great. And just to be cognizant of time, Kate, I kept looking for how long to go for to leave space for questions as well. I just want to make sure that if
Yeah.
folks, yeah, because sometimes there's so many facts and figures around the incinerators, but also just around waste and zero waste and, you know, the whole gambit. So I just want to make
Yes.
sure I have time to ask questions.
Thanks for asking. We want to end the event at 8 o'clock. So I would say 7:40, 7:45, and then questions, and then we'll be done.
Great. Yeah, and if folks, feel compelled, please, ask questions away in the chat, but also know I'll be kind of focused on the presentation. So if I don't see them at first, I will certainly see them after I'm done, but don't think I'm ignoring them. I think my screen can only show one thing to me at a time. But yeah, I can get started now. Uh, okay. All right. Can everybody see that? Wonderful. All right. So yeah, my name's Krystle D'Alencar. I've been with the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table for about 4 years now, coming up on 4 years. Before that, I was actually getting my master's in environmental engineering. So I have an engineering background. I did leave the program, but actually plan to finish probably in the next year. Um, and then previous to that, I've done everything from public health care policy, international healthcare policy, education, a lot of different jobs since I did undergrad, which was focused on international healthcare policy. I'm originally from Boston, but I've been living in the Twin Cities for about 10 years now. So got into environmental justice because environmental issues have always really pulled me. My own family grew up in environmental justice area in Boston as a frontline community, and both my mother and my father are from my mother's from Puerto Rico and my father's from Bolivia, and both my family members and families overseas in both areas have been subjected to some pretty serious exploitation and being sacrifice zones for, in the name of progress for other countries, and in ways that they themselves have not been able to benefit from, of course, because, both their lands and their own labor being exploited. And so definitely has always been something that has been very important to me. And so as I got out of the healthcare policy and really policy in general, I wanted to go into an area of work where I was able to really speak from a place of expertise on environmental issues, and especially the technological, right? The technological solutions that everyone is so quick to seek out, but not really wanting to hear about or come to terms with those repercussions that come with modernization. So that's kind of what led me into engineering. And then this campaign really out of the pandemic, took me in. I was only working part-time, but I really fell in love with the work and what was coming out of Minneapolis, and what I saw could be something as a blueprint for really the nation. So it's a little bit about me and my background and kind of what brought me to this, that I thought kind of gives a little context for, my place in this fight. So, so this is the campaign to shut the trash burner and reach zero waste. Um, a lot of the idea with shutting down the incinerator is not just about this one particular facility. It's much grander than that. It's really about how we need to create a societal shift, a cultural shift with how we handle consumption, both consumption and of course the end product waste. And so this is very much a larger issue than this facility itself, which is also what really impassions my drive in wanting to win this fight, is because in order to really shut this down, we need to think about how we are getting to this place to begin with. We really need to get to the root cause, because we certainly are not advocates for landfills either. So that's a lot of our work, as well as it's not focused on the facility. But I just wanted to do a little grounding question first for folks, to kind of start things off, but maybe just a couple of answers for people here. And so the question is, what are your memories around how you got rid of waste as a young person, and how has that changed or evolved over time? And maybe this isn't you. Maybe you have been doing the same thing since the get-go, and you've been a composter, recycler since you were a kid, and you got that from your own family, but something you observed. So, but if anyone, wants to provide an answer, would love to hear a couple of folks. I can't see hands, so please feel free to come off mic.
So this is Kate. I just put in the chat that as a child in the 60s and 70s, we never had to go to a dump. It was always picked up curbside. I do remember recycling. As an adult, it's picked up curbside and we compost at home.
And Jean, I see you have your hand up.
I remember my older brother and my sister, to some extent, she was afraid of burning it, but we had a 55-gallon drum on the edge of our property, and we would take our garbage out there and burn it in this drum back in the 50s and early 60s. I'm really aging myself here, but anyway.
Jean, I'll age myself too, because we had an alley behind our house and everyone had the same drum, and we burned a lot of stuff in that. And then we also had a city dump where we dropped stuff off too. So, yeah.
This is Victoria Reinhardt, and I grew up in Hastings, and I'm 71 years old, so we're talking a long time ago. But we also had a burn barrel. And recycling, the only thing we dealt with as far as recycling was because we could get a little extra money if we picked up bottles and turned them in to get the refund on it. So, I mean, and by the way, I mean, most of the people on this call probably know me, but I have been working on this issue regarding the environment and garbage and composting and food waste and all of this for a few decades now. And so there's a lot that's happened since then, but that's what I grew up with in Hastings.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Yeah, thank you everybody for sharing. Yeah, go ahead, Bob. I see your hand up.
I have probably a little different experience growing up on a central Minnesota farm. I don't recall any garbage pickup. I don't recall any burning. All garbage simply went out. If there was waste, first of all, I don't think we wasted too much, but everything went right back on the ground, right back to nature.
And I will add what happened in rural Indiana on a farm. I'm 72 years old, so it's been a while. We divided up our waste as for garbage, paper, and then cans and bottles. And the cans and bottles went into a dump we had. And the paper was burned, and then the food waste was, I guess it was composted in that we just dumped them in a different part on the farm. So that's what we did.
Thank you so much.
They got some sort of waste pickup. I don't know what, maybe in the 90s, or I don't know when they actually got that. It eventually did come to the farm though.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, hearing a lot of similar cases, of course, whether it was was burning or putting back into land. And also some folks did have pickup. I think obviously geography plays a role. The actual services, provided by county, city plays a role. A lot of times too, class certainly, and what you knew, education. For myself, I grew up as a kid. I had 5 brothers, and some trash was burned in the backyard. But the only thing that got us to recycle, or the reason my family recycled, was um, being able to collect those cans and turn them in for for money. And so that kind of was a driving and an incentive factor for us to do recycling. And then, of course, I learned from friends going to friends' houses about just how much their families were recycling, and was able to bring that back to my family. And then all of us kids became a very annoying bunch to our parents and grandparents who did not care so much about, where it was going, just that it was going somewhere. Didn't fully trust the recycling system, but because we pestered them so much, they, followed suit and recycled. So yeah, it's really always interesting, and such a pleasure to hear kind of the different ways we've handled it. So I appreciate everyone sharing a little bit. So as far as an incinerator, some folks here may know, be far familiar, and others may not. So the incinerators are a waste management facility that burns trash, simply put. They're known on paper as waste to energy because some of the steam from burning that trash is used for electricity and heat. Now, one thing I want to say off the bat, because I get this question, so I kind of want to nip it in the bud. I can certainly go more into it, but a lot of folks ask, well, if heat and electricity power is provided through the steam, what would be in its place if an incinerator were to shut down? And one thing to clear up is that these facilities are not directly contributing electricity. It's not going from A to B. They are putting power back into the grid. So it's actually very easily replaceable. That electricity and that power that they are getting from burning that trash just goes into the grid. And that's where all these places that are quote unquote heated by the incinerator are getting it. It's from the grid, not directly from the incinerator. And that stands true for all of the incinerators. And I just want to name that because it's also one of the most expensive ways to make electricity. Any economist and anybody, no matter where they are on the side of incineration or not, would tell you that it is the most expensive way to get electricity. It's not a source you want to be for your electricity. It is also the most carbon intensive way to get electricity. It's more carbon intensive than a coal plant to get the same amount of electricity. So just to name, this is something I have to really honing in on that, because incinerators, a lot of their sell is that, oh, look, you throw your trash and then poof, 1-to-1, it becomes electricity and heat. First of all, that's not how physics and chemistry works. It does not, it is not a 1-to-1 deal. You get a little bit of electricity and heat from all of the tonnage, hundreds of thousands of tonnage that you get from trash burning, just a little bit. And that power that you're getting is incredibly expensive to make through that avenue and very carbon intensive. So just to name that, and yet with that being said, they still use this waste to energy name in place of incineration and trash burning, because it sounds quite nice. Location of the HERC incinerator, for folks who are more familiar with Hennepin County or may have lived in Minneapolis, it is downtown. It's right next to the Twin Stadium. In fact, there's no signage. This is the facility right here, and there's no signage anywhere around it about what it is. I think there's maybe a couple of very, very small, signs that are as large as a letterhead, really, on a fencing. But nobody ever knows what this facility is because it doesn't indicate it. In fact, the Twins asked them to put that Target Field Station, the sign right here, that has no relation to the incinerator, but they asked them to put it there to dissuade the public from knowing that these Twins games were happening right next to a trash burner. It's a little fun fact about that signage. The Red Wing and Mankato trash burners, those are the two other major trash burners in Minnesota. Of course, as the names, the Xcel Energy plant technically is what it's called in Red Wing. This is the Red Wing plant on the left side here, and then the Mankato plant. Now, these are important because although I'm going to be focusing a lot about the HERC, the reason is because the HERC is just the campaign, obviously, that I am most, that I know best of all, but essentially all the facts and figures, a lot of those, aside from quantity, but pertaining to what emissions are coming out, the problems with it, all of those kinds of things, it is very much paralleled by these other incinerators. So everything I will talk about, even though I'm talking specifically about the HERC, please know that Red Wing and Mankato, all of that still applies. The difference, of course, is the tonnage that goes to them. Now, Ramsey County and Washington, our trash, and I'm in St. Paul technically, actually. I work on this campaign in Minneapolis. I am in St. Paul. So my trash, I will say my and we, because I'm part of Ramsey. Our trash, of course, as a lot of folks know, goes to the Ramsey and Washington Recycling Center. Now, a lot of the gloating around that facility is that they are extracting recyclable materials, precious metals, things like that. And then what is left over is called RDF, refuse derived fuel. That RDF, they say, then gets, again, kind of the propagandizing around energy and trash to energy, gets sent to become power. And what they mean is it's going to these incinerators. So after that stop, when the things are extracted, it then goes to Red Wing, Mankato, and I think there was a third in Newport. I forgot if that's still running, but Ramsey County, Washington County, at the end of the day, we are also burning our trash. But there's a pit stop, so that's why folks don't quite know about those incinerators or have any idea that the trash is getting burned for Ramsey as well. So for Hennepin County, or specifically Minneapolis, the HERC is burning about 365,000 tons a year. So that's 1,000 tons a day. But for Ramsey and Washington, combined, all these incinerators are burning about 250,000 tons or something along those lines as well.
Excuse me, I don't know how to raise my hand. I'm on a phone that I don't know how to do that on.
No problem.
But I'm a former Ramsey County Commissioner, chair of the Partnership on Waste and Energy. So this has been something I've worked on a long time. And some of the things you're saying aren't as accurate as I would hope they would be. And I think one of the things that people need to know is why are counties in this business in the first place? And that's because of the Waste Management Act, when Minnesota state legislature said, counties, you're going to be responsible for waste. And you'll have no unprocessed waste going into landfills by 1991. Clearly that didn't happen. So these waste to energy facilities, and that's what the industry calls them. I don't think we made it up, but we were told that we had to do this. Ramsey and Washington went together. And yes, it's a refuse derived fuel facility. But as we go on here, I would just like to point out that this isn't something that we would choose to do. And I totally agree with you. It is a lousy way to produce energy, but it does. But it's very expensive. It's not what we should be doing with it. But there are other things that we are going to plan to do, and I can talk about that later. But I do think it's important to know why we're here. And so, this is something that's on Ramsey County taxpayers and Hennepin and Washington. They chose a different mechanism in Hennepin. We have more flexibility, I think, with ours. But I can tell you about what happens at that facility at some point if you would like me to. But I do think that the counties didn't get into this business because they thought, gee, this is something we could really do. I am a strong environmental advocate, and I'm excited about where we're going with this facility. I wasn't excited about where it came from, but I wasn't there when that happened. So, but I'd be happy to talk about what the future plans are for that facility and how we're going to take more and more waste out of that facility. Thank you. But I don't know how to.
Oh. Yep, that's okay. No, I'm just curious, what parts was I saying, just for my own understanding, were inaccurate of what I was speaking to?
Well, I guess I didn't write everything down, but the characterization of it, first of all, not being no energy being produced, or it's not 1-to-1. I don't think anybody's ever said it was. We
But
didn't.
I mean, if even in the name itself, right, waste, and I never claimed that the counties are the ones who called it waste to energy. It's certainly from the industry, but when
Yes.
you are speaking of something, right, especially from a government, and transparency is really important, and you're calling it waste to energy and talking about it in this idea of just, I mean, the name in itself, I think a lot of it is the semantics, waste to energy. Of course, folks are thinking as they're seeing descriptions of the incinerator, anybody who's gone to the airport in Minneapolis, there's trash cans that literally say, throw your trash, this is going to be turned into energy. So it doesn't have to necessarily, I guess my point is simply that it doesn't necessarily have to be said, it's one-to-one. There's a very strong, I think, intended implication there for folks to believe that their trash is turning into energy.
I think that what I was trying to get through was the fact that this isn't something that we thought of doing. It's not something that counties named. It's stuff that's been, things have been happening across the world for a long time in this area. And it sounds like we somehow had this great scheme of how to do something when all we're trying to do is trying to figure out the best way to deal with the waste that we produce. And so one of the reasons that I chimed in here tonight, or that I came on tonight, was I'd like to know, I mean, I know that we're going to be doing some things as far as Ramsey and Washington County wide, pulling out food scraps, anaerobic digestion, pyrolysis, getting rid of PFAS, all of these other things that are happening there that haven't happened yet, but we're in the process of getting there. It takes a while, such as they do in Sweden. But really to learn what can we do, because there's still going to be waste there. And I know zero waste doesn't mean that you don't produce any waste. It's what you do with it. And so I thought I could learn more about that. That's what I'm really curious about, because um, we've got to figure out a way to do it. And I figured I could learn from you. But when it comes to the waste and energy facility, or the recycling and energy facility is the way we have renamed it, rebranded it, because of what we're trying to do with moving more out of the waste stream there as it comes in. Obviously, we need to do other things as well, but would like to really figure out how we can work together to make this happen, because I don't really feel like there's a bad guy in all of this. I think everybody's trying to do what they think is right, but everybody needs to work together. And that's what I am excited about hearing tonight.
All right, so in the interest of time, let's let Krystle continue with her presentation, and then if we have time at the end, we can continue to along those lines of discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, definitely. And certainly happy and excited to also get into a lot of that as well. I think, and just for, to name and be upfront about obviously my campaign and the environmental justice and the Zero Burn Coalition, a lot of our campaign is very much about pulling away from incineration, because it is by our understanding and belief from a lot of experts and research that has been happening internationally, and especially more so as we are learning about things like PFAS. We are learning the degree of particulate matter and just how harmful that is. A lot of new information is coming about with emissions that we didn't know before. And so a lot of it too is just about adapting as we are getting new science and information. And so, yes, of course, if, things weren't understood or known once upon a time. It gets to a point, though, that when information is coming in, we do have to deal with that and sort of shift how we have been doing things. And so that's a lot of with our campaign as well, too, is just based off of research and science. We have a lot of scientists in our coalition and engineers as well, right? I think a lot of times, too, it becomes a sort of war of the experts, so to speak, with a lot of these things. And I think both sides have to understand that we also, it's not just, random community members who are just coming up with a lot of what they're speaking to as far as the harms. This is also, grounded in research. So, but a little bit on the incinerator, the HERC incinerator, there were plans actually for a waste disposal site. Again, this is specific to the HERC initially, that were going to be in the more affluent suburbs, specifically in Edina, in the 1980s, but they filed a lawsuit and they said, you are certainly not going to put a waste disposal site out here. So instead, Hennepin County, the plans became to create an incinerator in 1989 and placed it in downtown. And the community, as you can see, this is a paper from that time, from 80s, a page from that paper. Community was incredibly angry. They did not want that incinerator on the north side and downtown. Also, to also name downtown at that time was not what it is today. That area is considered now the North Loop, which, if folks have been there, it is a very different landscape than in the 80s. It was very working class, low income, industrious. And those folks, and then also the north side, did not want this incinerator. And so it's really been a 30+ year fight of wanting to get this out. And through this timeline, you can see there are different kind of peaks and valleys of the fight. In 2004, Hennepin County bought the HERC, and they hired a very controversial company, Covanta. If you Google them, they have hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits that have been over the years of operating incinerators that have been filed against them. After about 13 years, they got kicked out because they ran it so terribly. So just also think about, for 13 years of a poorly run incinerator or trash burner taking about 75% of Minneapolis's trash, what that means for health impacts, environmental impacts. And then in 2009 through 2014, community fought against an expansion because they actually wanted to expand how much waste was going there, increasing it from 1,000 to 1,200 tons a day. And then community won this fight. Actually, Attorney General Keith Ellison was part of that fight and helped really, because he's a North Sider. And so that sort of kicked up this new energy for actually getting the incinerator shut down completely, because community, I think, found, wait, why are we dealing with this at all? Never mind an expansion. And so that's where the Zero Burn Coalition, a lot of different advocates and community, people who've, again, been doing this for over 30 years, really took to amping and ramping up this campaign to call for its complete closure and to actually implement zero waste solutions. Because again, this isn't about shutting down the facility. This is tens of millions of dollars are getting poured into keeping this facility running. In fact, right today, it is $37 million in debt. And all of that money could instead be going into zero waste solutions, which we'll talk a little bit about in a bit. But just to name that, again, this has been a very long fight. This didn't just start with our coalition 5 years ago. There's been a lot of different periods in which community has been trying to get this shut down. The burner was placed in an already overburdened community. So this is where we get the terminology of things called sacrifice zones or environmental justice areas. A lot of this has kind of really only entered our lexicon in the last 10 years, when environmental justice has been brought into the whole environmental fight. Because environmental justice is very specific to frontline communities and sacrifice zones, people who have been historically for generations, really, and still presently the most impacted from our environmental issues. And the north side is certainly no exception to that. So the north side, they have Highway I-94, which as a lot of folks may be familiar with history, ripped through Black communities, a lot of working class communities, white low income, white working class as well, and produces an incredible amount of emissions. And the incinerator was built pretty much right on the cross section of I-94 and Olson Memorial, which is another major roadway. So all the air pollutants from all these different sources are being experienced by that community. Not to mention a shingles factory, which is located on a block in a street that is nicknamed Cancer Row, basically north side Minneapolis's own Cancer Row, because of the emissions that come out of this GF shingles factory. Northern Metals was shut down not too long ago, in the last decade, because it was a metals recycling facility that was they were also self-reporting. A lot of facilities do, because it'd be incredibly taxing, of course, for counties and cities to have to be reporting on those facilities. So that's not abnormal. But in the case of Northern Metals, they were actually inflating their numbers. And there was a whistleblower who brought that to light. And so there were a lot of violations that were going underreported, and community fought and got that shut down. But this was all within about a 1/4 mile radius of each other in the north side. So we can kind of skip this just for a matter of time, but regulations, emission standards, permit requirements, self-reporting. What are some loopholes or flaws you can think of around how our government currently creates these protective safeguards? So again, this isn't to demonize. I think when we talk about standards and emissions and regulations, yes, of course, these are things that we need and we want and are good. However, they have their serious limitations. And one of those is when it comes to facilities, toxic facilities, a lot has not been taken into account until really just a few years ago with the passing of the cumulative impacts bill for cumulative impacts. So that's a little bit of what I was just speaking to in the last slide. When facilities are put into an area, they don't have to consider the area's environmental impacts as it is. So certain, I mean, speaking very loosely, but if there's a lot of emissions, for example, that highway, before the cumulative impacts bill, certain facilities could just be built there, regardless of whether frontline communities live there, what environmental justice issues, what pollutants were at a XYZ degree. And so that's one thing that is a loophole as far as when we talk about, the HERC, perfect example, meets the MPCA and the EPA standards. Certainly does, but that is not, those standards do not take into account all those other facilities, all those other emissions. And what you and I breathe in are not facilities or certain things in isolation. We breathe in everything in accumulation, right? And so that's why a lot of people, and I say this from I'm deep in community. I am constantly every day doing one-to-ones, talking to community, door knocking, and the amount of people, and I track it all of the time, who said I did not have asthma until I moved to this area, right? And it's hard, and the reason that doesn't get change regulations is because we have a system in America that very, very stringently and strictly works off of direct causation. And so it makes it very easy for these kinds of facilities to function, because someone can't say, oh, I got lung cancer specifically because of the particulate matter and dioxins coming from this very specific facility. It's a very hard thing to link, right? So this is also what makes it very hard to fight a lot of these things, or for community to speak on behalf of what's happening to them in their environment. Also to name that a lot of our EPA standards, the Environmental Protection Agency standards, are not at the same standard as the World Health Organization. So a good example of that is our when we're talking about particulate matter. We only changed our standards within the last few years, but even I think in 2023, the EPA's own science advisory board, their own board, had advised them to lower emission threshold for particulate matter, and they ignored that. So, again, this isn't, about demonizing or saying there's a bad guy or a good guy, but the proof is in the pudding, right? When your own science advisory board is telling you to lower a threshold for what people can breathe in, you should probably listen to that. And that threshold still wasn't up to the standard of the World Health Organization, right? So when this is just something to keep note of, when people are talking about a certain facility meets these standards, those are the standards that we're talking about. And also those standards are only for a certain amount of emissions and pollutants. There's hundreds of emissions and different toxins coming out of the incinerator that we that there are not as stringent of standards for, not to mention any standards at all. PFAS, which a lot of people are familiar with, was a perfect example of that. PFAS is only something that we learned about in the last few years, and yet how long have we had PFAS in all of our materials? Decades, right? So this is also about what we're burning that we don't even know yet that we're breathing in until the science comes to let us know. So as far as I just wanted to name this too about emissions and regulations. Burning in wood and trash might qualify as carbon-free under the new 2040 climate law. And regulators, this is again about the same idea. This just happened last year. So this is still, even burning wood may count as carbon-free, and burning trash too. So these are, this is the government agencies that are naming these things, or making making these very hard obstacles for something that should be as clear cut as carbon-free. That's certainly not carbon-free, and yet this is something that we're still dealing with. So just a few things that happened with the incinerator itself. we only got data for the past 4 years. We're still waiting on decades of it. And just for what we did find in 2019, this is just one example. There's a few of these. A mercury filter was not in operation, and a regulator was not notified. So you have to think about, what does it mean for individuals or a population to be walking around a facility that's burning 75% of Minneapolis's trash when a mercury filter is not in operation. Also, in the same year, while performing routine duties, 2 workers had experienced burns to 1/4 and 1/3 of their bodies, with a total payout of over $1 million because of that injury. It's also incredibly dangerous to be working in this facility. And we've also heard this and know this from actually a whistleblower that we are in contact with, who worked at that facility for over a decade. So the trash burn is one of the biggest polluters in the county, in Hennepin County. Types of pollution, and again, this also is the same deal as far as these types of pollutions, not the same numbers of rankings, but the types of pollutions are also what happens in Red Wing and Mankato. Nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, particulate matter 2.5, lead, particulate matter 10, carbon monoxide, some of the health impacts that come out of that. A lot of folks know this. Lead, mercury, as I named, particulate matter is especially one that I think we are hearing and learning more and more about. A few papers just came out a few months ago about how particulate matter is already impacting children's learning abilities. Their cognitive abilities are actually lessened when folks are closer to increases in particulate matter, and actually that only a small amount of particulate matter could affect children's learning abilities. So, again, as the science is coming to fruition, we are learning more and more. Dioxins and furans are some of the most dangerous chemical emissions that come out of specifically burning plastic. And as we know, our plastic industry is shot through the roof, and it's really no end in sight. So the more plastics that we are really putting into our materials and the microplastics entering our bodies, we have to imagine the kinds of cancers that are only, awaiting us with all of dioxins and furans. And, burning that is certainly not going to lead to a good outcome. Twin Cities residents, this was a paper put out actually by the Minnesota Pollution Control and the Department of Health. So from both these government entities, they found that air pollution played a role in 10% of all deaths in Twin Cities, along with nearly 500 hospitalizations and emergency room visits for heart and lung problems. So all in all, incineration, really conclusively is for us is certainly not the answer. We believe that it is a false solution. It's very much been in the past greenwashed as the green solution to landfilling. A lot of different sites and facilities will certainly essentially brag about their own waste to energy facilities. And what we're trying to name too is that it's not just a choice between landfilling and trash burning. It's a choice between landfills or trash burners and landfills, because about 20% of what goes into an incinerator comes out as toxic ash. So even though ash is treated at a different landfill, again, there's a lot of loopholes around that, because there's a lot of metals that are still not extracted from that. And that ash then gets put into concrete, pavement. This is different kinds of ash landfills will do this, create sort of concrete or different materials out of that ash. And so thinking about road erosion, again, what happens when you're getting dust particles from this kind of toxic ash. There's a lot of loopholes around treating, the treatment. It does not mean that this ash all of a sudden becomes negligible in health impact. So it's still using a landfill when we are using incineration. And so that's kind of the point of this slide here, is to name that it's not one or the other. So what is the solution? zero waste, right? We, at the end of the day, we are consuming too much. We live in a culture that defines success through overbuying. It happens because workers and land are taken advantage of, and because areas like North and South Minneapolis, but also rural areas, plenty of areas are treated as sacrifice zones, right? This is also the case with communities who live around landfills. They're certainly not putting landfills in Edina or Eden Prairie. And so this is really a case across the board of incinerators and landfills. So for us, shutting down the HERC forces the county to deal with the waste crisis. Everything we throw away still comes back at us. 2/3 of the waste can be recycled or composted. But for us, the HERC prevents us. It acts as an obstacle, again, because of this propagandizing that it's a green solution to landfills, that it's so much better than landfills. And folks really do believe that, their waste is just getting turned to energy. So it's just simply not that bad. Again, I mentioned this earlier, the hundreds of millions that have gone into the aging facility could be spent on zero waste initiatives. And what could that fund for our community? So with zero waste, we have the solutions. I think as Victoria named earlier, of course, there's still going to be there's still going to be waste, right? But what we have and what we haven't attempted, I think, very much across the nation is a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to zero waste. And a lot of that isn't our fault. I think we tend to put things, the onus of responsibility on the individual. Obviously, of course, we all have our role to play. We all need to do something that is 100% true. And we didn't always live like this. I mean, I've heard a lot of folks saying when we were first asking that question about how people handled their trash when they were younger, there was hardly waste to begin with, right? How much has that actually changed? And a lot of that isn't just because somebody woke up one day and decided to consume more than their parents or their grandparents. This was very much a marketing ploy. This is something that societally, there's another entity at play. It's not just about us waking up one day and wanting to waste more. And that increase in waste, I should also name, because I've gotten this question before, is not because of population expansion. If you were to look at a graph and see how population growth has moved and our waste, they do not match. They're not parallel. Our waste is far outweighing how much our population growth is. And that's not also as an indication of, oh, well, we're doing better economically, so we buy more stuff. Even if that was the case, which it's not, I don't necessarily know that that's the route we should be going on, because that waste is ending up somewhere. And also that extraction, that land extraction, that land destitution to get that stuff can't last forever. And that's really the result of what we're now experiencing, a major climate crisis. So for us, zero waste is really talking about how do we tackle the low-hanging fruit that we really haven't even begun to talk about or do. And some of that is, first and foremost, I always talk about education. I think this is one that we're really missing the ball on. There's education in, putting that in schools, primary schools, right from, what we're talking preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, building those habits from the get-go. Obviously, little kids aren't always going to be the best when it comes to throwing out things in the right bins, but how are we teaching them, or how are we having someone there guide them so that they do understand that? And then, of course, bringing that into high schools. When we talk about environmental issues, a lot of times in our high schools, there's an environmental club, and then that's a wrap. Or maybe there's an environmental day or an environmental week, and then we wipe our hands clean of that, when we really should be instilling actual education and ongoing education and curriculum about how our climate has gotten to where it has gotten, and how waste and hyperconsumption are very much players in that. Because when we talk about waste, we're talking about the whole lifeline of a product, right? From the extraction to the transportation, all of these levels to get to the waste are the contributors to our greenhouse gas emissions, right? It's not just about the incineration or the landfill methane or the production of a product. It's everything from extraction through transportation to that end. So kids and people don't even think of that, right? When we're looking at all the, pie chart of where we get our greenhouse gas emissions, and we see, oh, this only applies to this. No, everything's interconnected, right? And so when we're talking about production and how we get our stuff, we're talking about pretty much hitting every piece of that pie. So education, of course, making use of more reuse centers, right? Reuse and repair. This is a major one that we need to create a better policy around, repairing things, having more reuse centers, really things, textiles, like being able to sew something, or repairing those items. Electronics repair, for example, right? iPhones are, I'm using iPhones as an extreme example, but it's the most perfect example. There's a new model or a new what have you every 2 years, and people then toss their iPhone. And, that's also, again, this is not just about the onus and responsibility of an individual, right? Apple got sued because they were quite literally slowing down their older versions when they made a new version of a phone. So people would have to purposefully toss out their iPhone. So this isn't just, again, about individuals. This is also about something, the corporations and manufacturers, right, creating this kind of society. Next day delivery, another example. Yeah, people are like, next day delivery, no cost. Sure. Of course, I have the choice to not do that, but when it's so available, people are going to do it. So extended producer responsibility, right? That kind of policy. Also, composting infrastructure and food waste. This is the big one, or the one that I really would love to see more policy and more local solutions around, because policy can only bring us so far. We really need to do this on a hyper local level. And so for me, and a lot of folks in the Zero Waste Coalition that I'm in, and really at large, when I'm talking to folks about waste, people are always talking about food waste. And so a lot of folks, I think, especially older generations, certainly do not waste as much food as others, but we're also living in a different time where folks are working very wild hours to survive, and people are not cooking and using as much as they could back before. And so how are we also alleviating that and being able to create an infrastructure and a system where we are rescuing food if we can't use it? And this can be everywhere from the root, right, at grocers to the farms. There's a lot of food waste all along the line from those farms to the grocers to our own table. And so food rescue and figuring out, right, because there's other countries and there's other places that actually do this. So we have examples. This isn't just, having to reinvent the wheel. South Korea, for example, they have an incredible food waste infrastructure. Composting and food rescue infrastructure, where I think only 5% of what they are wasting is going to landfills, and I think another 5% is going to incineration. But overall, they have about a 75% waste diversion rate. And the reason for that is because they got very bold and very serious about food waste and composting infrastructure. And so for them, they had really strong policy. However, obviously, again, that can only bring us so far. So a lot of what we are trying to figure out and look for is, how do we create that infrastructure from neighborhood to neighborhood where we have composting sites? There's a lot of red tape. It's obviously not easy. It's a lot of education, but it's creating jobs as well. If we are creating this kind of infrastructure, we're also not just having to give away our food scraps and organics to the city or the county to make money off of. We ourselves can, be able to use that for our own gardens, or a community garden, have a community composting and urban gardens. Then you are benefiting both from your own food and your own food scraps right there in your own neighborhood, rather than just giving that to the county. Now, of course, that's not going to work for everyone. Folks live in apartment buildings and townhouses, but I think that's where community gardens kind of come into place. But still, yes, of course, we should also have, organics pickups. And how are we expanding that? And making that a multifamily home, because even in in Minneapolis, there is not the organics pickup for multifamily. So, sorry, I know we're coming up on time, so I'll pause there.
So, okay, Krystle, thank you. Again, next month, we're going to talk considerably about food waste. And I just wanted to point out a couple questions in the chat. Does any of the recycling actually get recycled, and what percentage of trash is incinerated? And I don't know.
Sure.
They're talking about county or.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll answer the first one, I believe was yes, recycling is getting recycled. I would encourage, this has been one that we've really had to work hard to, a sort of myth bust, is that people who put their recycling is not actually going to recycling. I would encourage folks to take a tour of Eureka Recycling. They offer tours. There's, I think, other maybe recycling facilities do the same. And you can see the process for yourself. Eureka Recycling, for example, who's a big recycler here. They're, I think, one of the only nonprofit recyclers in the entire country. They have an 85%, it may be closer to 90% markets for their recyclables. So your recyclables are going and hitting a market, not just, getting to the facility and then you don't know what's going to happen with it. It's 85% of what goes to that facility comes out and is recycled and reused as a product. And then the percent of waste that's going to the HERC incinerator, 75% of Minneapolis's waste gets burned at the incinerator. I know that for Minneapolis, but as far as Ramsey and Washington, I'm not as sure of how much the percentage of that waste gets burned and landfilled.
Okay. And then Victoria and I pointed out that in Sweden and Switzerland, they seem to have the ability to separate out their trash, burn it efficiently with highly filtered air, for lack of a better term, and power nearby cities. Has anybody really looked at that or visited those places to see if that is something we could adopt?
If I could, yes. That's why the facilities, what we're trying to do right now with Ramsey and Washington, in conjunction with Hitachi Zosen Demcon, is to take that what we saw in Sweden and put it here.
Mhm.
And so we're working on that in Ramsey and Washington counties. Right now, it's not all through it, but the food scrap program, it's free. You get the bags, and and we separate that out. We're pulling out more. We took the model there and tried to incorporate it. And it's not fully operational yet because it's going to take time to get that done. But we're pretty proud of what we're doing there. I also think, and I put it in the chat, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you're talking about as far as zero waste. There isn't one and done as far as what we need to do here. But there are some things that we can do within the bigger picture. There's not just one answer. And I think that's what you were saying, Krystle. We have to figure out, how do we do this? And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do there. And they give tours at the Recycling and Energy Center. Really, it's pretty incredible what we've done there since we purchased it. And we purchased it because, again, kind of the same thing, not the same company or anything, but it wasn't being run the way we wanted it to be run. And I can tell you that when we decided to purchase it, I said, I want everybody to know that we are going to go towards gasification and doing things differently, keeping waste out of the garbage, all of these things, or I wouldn't even consider it. And so that's how come we've done so many improvements there. But
we all have another question too from Jean. I don't know, can we let Jean jump in right before we're done here?
You got to unmute, Jean.
I was wondering if you are going to promote the plastic-free challenge for February, Krystle and the commissioner, I'm sorry, the woman that was just speaking, Victoria.
I assume that is part of the NEMCO's. But yeah, by the way, there's one other thing that is really important for the folks to know here is the Extended Producer Responsibility Act for packaging, plastic packaging passed last year. So when you're talking about plastic, that is probably going to be under attack during this session because it's the business sector has to start ponying up if they're going to do this. But I think the idea of February being plastic free sounds great to me.
So just before we go, just a couple other comments from people. There's a new Ramsey County Environmental Service Center that's starting on April 1st. Kelly Moeller has suggested that she likes the Buy Nothing groups. I've used the repair clinics in Ramsey County, which have been very helpful. And what else was in the chat? That We have an increase in cheap clothes, cheap appliances, and it's no longer cheaper to repair. It's easier to throw it away than to try to get it fixed. So that's the kind of climate that we're living in. So with that, I would like to thank Krystle for your informative presentation. And I think we opened up some other interesting tidbits, and we can sort of expand on this, or this is a good segue to our food waste segment in February. So we look forward to you folks joining us then. And Krystle, you did put up some information about how to contact you and how to contact the Zero Waste Coalition. So if you have any other questions, I'm sure Krystle would be happy to address them if you emailed her. So
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Okay, that's Diane, I think, and you know Mick, correct?
I don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay. Okay.
We can
Right.
talk later. How about?
Yeah, sounds good.
I think she did a good job, and I'm glad. I guess she was having trouble getting her computer. So
Yeah, I'm glad she
on
got in with
everything.
her phone
Had a
and
lot of tremendous information. So
yeah,
there's just really a lot of interest in it. So
yeah.
yeah.
How much were we delayed at the beginning? Was it just about 5 minutes or so?
Well, I think she got logged on about 3 minutes late.
Okay, and I talked for
Was
what, less than 5 minutes, right?
So I think when we trim it down, we're going to have an hour's worth.
Okay,
You know what I mean? Like if we cut out the time that we had at the beginning
yeah,
and stuff. I'm going to say end recording here. Let's
okay.
see.